Hey guys, tonight we begin with something stranger than any raid or battle. Not Viking ships, not treasure, but the one thing they all feared most: bedtime. Picture it. You, crammed into a smoky wooden hall with 50 sweaty bodies, goats breathing in your ear, fleas chewing your ankles, and an axe tucked under your blanket because even in sleep, someone might try to kill you. Forget the myths of horned helmets and glorious feasts. The real terror of the Viking Age was trying to close your eyes without being eaten alive by bugs, choked by smoke, or stabbed by your neighbour. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your bed is a low wooden frame packed with straw that crunches every time you shift. It smells like damp wool and old ale, because the stuffing hasn't been changed since last season. A rough wool blanket covers you, heavy and greasy from months of sweat and soot. It clings to your skin like a wet dog and weighs about as much too. To your left, someone is already snoring like an ox. To your right, a goat coughs politely into the darkness. Privacy isn't a Viking word. The fire pit in the centre of the longhouse smoulders, filling the air with smoke. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that doesn't do much besides let the rain in. Your eyes burn, your throat itches, and every deep breath feels like inhaling a bonfire. Yet without that smoke, you'd freeze solid, or be eaten alive by more bugs than even the fleas can keep track of. Viking sleep was less about rest, more about choosing your poison. And this is where the weapon comes in. Because even while half asleep, you clutch an axe or sword like a bedtime teddy bear. Archaeological digs and sagas tell us that Vikings didn't just keep weapons nearby for raids. They kept them close at night because enemies, rivals, and sometimes even drunk relatives could settle scores in the dark. Waking up unarmed was a luxury only fools could afford. Sleep was always one insult away from becoming a duel, but here's the twist. Sometimes you weren't just sleeping next to family, you might be sleeping beside sworn enemies too. Feasts, negotiations and raids often forced warriors to share bedding, shoulder to shoulder with people they hated. To refuse could be taken as weakness or insult. Imagine closing your eyes with someone sharpening their knife 3 inches from your face. That wasn't paranoia. That was Tuesday, and while you try to focus on not dying, the fleas chew at your ankles. They lived in every corner of the longhouse, nesting in straw bedding and wool clothing. Your legs itch, your scalp tingles, and you scratch until you bleed. Call it Viking exfoliation. Nobody asked for it, everybody got it. Superstition made it worse. Vikings believed in Draugr, restless undead who wandered at night to harass the living. Sleeping unarmed didn't just risk an attack from humans, but from spirits too. Carved runes, whispered charms, and protective rituals all tried to keep the dead out of your bed. Whether it worked or not, who knows? But the belief alone kept you gripping that axe like your life depended on it. You shift again, the straw pokes your ribs, and the air tastes like smoke mixed with sweat. Your axe handle digs into your chest, but you dare not set it aside. Around you, the longhouse groans in the wind, shadows creep in the rafters, and the sound of someone vomiting in the corner reminds you that fermented fish was never a safe dinner. This isn't rest, it's survival. And as the night stretches on, you realise the Vikings didn't just sleep with their weapons because they were paranoid, they did it because they had to. Every night was a battlefield of smoke, fleas, rivals, and the restless dead. And if you think this sounds unbearable, just wait until morning comes. Because dragging yourself out of this smoky, itchy nightmare was only the beginning of Viking misery. You begin to notice something odd about the Viking idea of comfort. It wasn't just the crowded bedding or the weapons tucked under blankets. It was what shared the longhouse with you. And no, not just family. The Vikings believed that livestock were as much a part of the household as people, and that meant the sheep, cows and goats often slept inside too. The animals weren't outside in a pen, They were right there in the hall, snoring, farting, and sometimes stepping on you when you least expected it. Archaeology of Viking settlements confirms stalls and partitions built directly into the longhouse floor plan, a practical way to keep animals alive through freezing winters, but a truly terrible way to fall asleep in peace. Imagine trying to drift off while a cow is chewing cud 3 feet from your head. The smell was impossible to ignore. Between human sweat, damp wool, and the tang of animal dung, a longhouse at night was a living stew of aromas. Some historians suggest that the constant exposure to smoke from the fire pit was not only for warmth, but also helped mask and disinfect the overwhelming stench. Your nose adjusted over time, but not before burning through every layer of tolerance you thought you had. Even sagas casually mention how smoky and foul the interiors could be, as though it was simply a background fact of life. The Vikings didn't think of this as disgusting, they thought of it as normal. To them, sleep without stink would have been suspicious, but the animals weren't just a nuisance, they were insurance. In a world of long winters and scarce food, losing livestock could mean disaster. Keeping them inside reduced the risk of theft and freezing, but it also turned bedtime into a strange farmyard carnival. Chickens would cluck at shadows, dogs barked at wind, and pigs grunted through dreams that only pigs can understand. If you did manage to sleep, it was rarely for long. You'd wake to hooves shifting, goats nibbling loose hay, or a sudden squeal in the dark that made every warrior grip his weapon tighter. The psychological effect was brutal. Sleep studies today show that broken rest leads to heightened aggression and irritability. You didn't need a laboratory to see that play out in a Viking hall. With warriors half-rested, half-starved and half-drunk, disputes flared easily. The sagas are full of descriptions of feasts ending in fights, where exhaustion played its quiet part in fraying tempers. The longhouse wasn't just a home. It was a pressure cooker of restless bodies and unstable moods. The weapon in your hand wasn't just a tool of survival. It was your version of a nightlight. Adding to the strain was the superstition that the night wasn't safe. Spirits, trolls, and the undead were believed to move freely when the fire dimmed. This wasn't folklore for children. To a Viking, it was real. Burial mounds of the era sometimes included heavy stones laid over bodies, a precaution to keep the dead from walking. And inside the hall, runes carved into beams or charms whispered before sleep offered flimsy protection. You weren't just fighting fleas, you were fighting the invisible. Each creak of the wood, each gust through the rafters, was an omen that something unwanted had found its way in. When you consider the architecture itself, things get even more interesting. Viking longhouses could be up to 75 feet long, with rows of wooden posts supporting heavy roofs of turf and thatch. These sod roofs insulated against brutal winters, but they also leaked, sagged, and dropped clumps of wet earth into the bedding below. Rain seeped in, snow melted through. If the roof was badly maintained, plants would start to grow right out of it, adding new wildlife to your already crowded dormitory. Waking up with mud dripping into your hair was as common as fleas biting your ankles. The longhouse was alive, and not in the good way. And yet sleep was essential. Viking days demanded punishing labour, whether rowing ships, harvesting crops, or preparing weapons. You needed rest, but rest never came easy. The very things that were supposed to keep you alive made sleep miserable. The fire smoked you, the animals stepped on you, the fleas gnawed you, and the roof dropped surprises onto your face. By morning you were as tired as when you went to bed, but you still had to rise because in the Viking world, idleness was shameful. Sleep deprivation was built into the culture, an unacknowledged sacrifice every warrior made simply by existing. And all this was happening under the constant threat of sudden violence. Raids weren't just something Vikings did abroad. They feared them at home too. Rival clans, feuding families, or opportunistic outlaws could burst into a hall at any hour. That is why sagas so often mention sleeping with weapons, or describe heroes leaping from their beds to fight. To be caught unarmed was not only shameful, it was fatal. And unlike in modern times, there was no locking the door. The door itself was often little more than a heavy plank of wood. Security was you, your axe, and your ability to wake up swinging before your attacker did. As grim as that sounds, the Vikings found meaning in it. Norse mythology placed huge emphasis on death in battle, and the idea that warriors chosen by the Valkyries would rise again in Valhalla. Sleep itself was seen as a kind of practice for death, a nightly brush with darkness that could turn permanent at any moment. The longhouse, with its crowded beds and lurking dangers, was a miniature version of that cosmic struggle. Every night you survived was another victory against the inevitable. You shift on your straw bedding again, scratching at your scalp while the smoke makes your eyes water. The animals grunt and stir around you, the warriors snore, and in the distance the wind howls across the fjord. The night stretches on, restless and loud, and you grip your weapon until your knuckles ache. This is not comfort. This is survival disguised as sleep. And yet, as bad as it was, the morning routine was somehow worse. Because once you pried yourself from that choking, itchy haze, you had to face the true test of Viking life. The freezing dawn, when the world outside the longhouse was even less forgiving than what waited inside. You start to notice that warmth is less of a luxury and more of a gamble. The longhouse keeps you alive through sheer body heat, but what you wear to bed decides whether you spend the night shivering or sweating in your own grime. Viking clothing was practical, but comfort was never part of the design brief. You slept in the same wool tunic you wore during the day, heavy with dirt, smoke, and whatever stew had splashed onto it at dinner. Wool was itchy, but it was also one of the best insulators available, and without it you would have frozen long before morning. Blankets were made from sheepskin, animal hides, or layered wool, and they absorbed everything around them. Smoke clung to the fibres, sweat soaked into the seams, and fleas nested inside. Archaeological finds of bedding remnants show layers of straw and animal furs matted together. The Viking version of a mattress topper. It might keep you alive through a Scandinavian winter, but it smelled like something that had been buried in a barn for a year. You never really wrapped yourself in softness. You wrapped yourself in a portable petri dish. And yet these rough materials were invaluable. Wool, despite its itch, stayed warm even when damp. Sheepskin held heat better than any linen. Animal hides offered durability, though they stiffened with age until they felt like sleeping under a stiff carpet. Linen was prized but expensive, so it was often reserved for undergarments or the wealthier classes. If you were poor, you layered whatever scraps you had and hoped your neighbour's body heat would make up the difference. Sleep was a community project, whether you liked it or not. The need for layers explains why weapons became part of the nightly routine. With so many coverings wrapped around you, it was hard to get up quickly. If a raid came in the night, you wouldn't have time to untangle yourself, find your boots and grab your axe. Instead, you kept it right there under the furs, ready to strike while still half tangled in wool. Historical accounts describe warriors leaping from bedding in full defence, swinging wildly before even standing upright. Sleep wasn't a chance to relax, it was a tactical pause between fights. There was another reason for sleeping in your clothes. Laundry was rare, slow and dangerous in cold climates. Water sources froze, soap was scarce, and stripping down in freezing weather could kill you. People simply wore the same garments for days, sometimes weeks before washing. By bedtime, every layer was a mixture of sweat, smoke and oil from meals. The odour was so strong it clung to the walls of the longhouse, adding to the rich cocktail of barnyard air. Forget scented candles. Your nightlight was the smell of 50 bodies in shared wool. Historians point out that this wasn't just a Viking problem. Across medieval Europe, washing was occasional at best, but the Scandinavian climate made it especially grim. Clothes were precious, woven slowly by hand from flax or wool, and losing a garment to rot or accident could take weeks to replace. People slept in their work clothes not from laziness but from necessity. Changing clothes was a privilege, not a habit. The psychological effect of sleeping in armour-like clothing with weapons close at hand is striking. Modern soldiers trained for combat readiness, but the Vikings lived it every night. You didn't just lie down unprotected. You wrapped yourself in itchy armour made of wool and hides, gripping an axe, while your enemies and allies both snored within arm's reach. Every twitch of fabric or creak of straw might have been nothing, or it might have been someone moving too close. The longhouse demanded constant alertness, even in half-sleep. Archaeology also shows the Vikings valued blankets and furs enough to include them in burials. Excavations of graves in Denmark and Norway reveal sheepskins, woven textiles, and bedding fragments carefully placed alongside weapons. To the Norse mind, sleep and death were connected. You needed warmth, weapons, and protection in both worlds. The grave was a permanent longhouse, complete with the same furnishings you used in life. And if you were wealthy, your bedding announced it. High-status Vikings had imported textiles, sometimes dyed or patterned, rare treasures in a land of rough homespun. Saga descriptions even mention bedding as a marker of status, noting silks or finely woven linens among kings and jarls. But even those luxurious layers could not mask the fleas. The parasites didn't care if your blanket was wool or silk. They bit everyone, regardless of wealth. Comfort was an illusion. Shared misery was the reality. You shift again in your imagined bedding, feeling the weight of wool pressing down, the straw crunching beneath, and the nagging scratch of fleas at your scalp. The air is still thick with smoke, and your axe handle presses against your chest. Somewhere in the darkness a neighbour stirs, the sound of metal clinking faintly as another weapon shifts under the covers. Nobody truly slept soundly in a Viking longhouse. Everyone was a soldier, even in slumber. The night feels endless, but the dawn always comes, and when it does, you drag yourself upright in the same filthy tunic, your hair stiff with smoke and your blanket crawling with pests. The axe you clutch through the night is still at your side, but now the real struggle begins. Because the Viking day demanded more than just survival in the dark. It demanded labour, strength, and an acceptance that sleep was never enough to restore you. The warmth of your blanket fades quickly when you remember what dinner was. Vikings did not eat lightly before bed. A feast could last for hours, with roasted meats, fermented fish, and jugs of ale filling every stomach until the hall reeked of grease and alcohol. Archaeological remains from Viking settlements confirm enormous hearths and discarded animal bones, evidence of meals that doubled as social events and survival strategies. Eating well was a display of strength, but it turned nightfall into a digestive endurance test. Sleep came with the weight of pork, barley and beer pressing down on your insides. Ale was the common drink of the age, safer than water, and it appeared at nearly every meal. Fermented from barley and flavoured with herbs, it was low in alcohol compared to modern brews, but when consumed in vast amounts, it left you drowsy, bloated, and snoring loud enough to shake the rafters. Saga descriptions of Viking feasts often end in stupors, with warriors collapsing into bed still clutching horns or cups. The firelight dimmed, but the smell of half-digested meat and sour ale thickened in the room, a reminder that sleep was never free of consequences. If you were wealthy, your meals were richer, with imported goods like honey, dried fruits, and occasionally wine from distant trade networks. Excavations in Birka and Hedeby uncovered amphorae and glassware, evidence of Mediterranean imports making their way north. That might sound luxurious, but honey and wine only added more fuel to the digestive fire. The stomach had to work overtime while the body tried to rest, leaving you rolling in the straw as your guts churned. The sagas never mention indigestion, but they didn't need to. Anyone who has eaten smoked fish and honey cakes in one sitting can imagine what the night smelled like. Superstition also seeped into mealtime rituals. Certain foods were believed to hold protective powers. Garlic, leeks, and onions appear in medicinal texts as cures and charms, sometimes hung near beds to ward off sickness or evil spirits. Archaeological finds of charred plant remains suggest these strong-smelling foods were staples, and in a smoky longhouse they only added another pungent layer to the air. Sleeping in that environment was like resting inside a stew pot, with every ingredient fighting for dominance in your nose. The connection between feasts and weapons was more direct than you might think. Feasting was not only for nourishment, it was political theatre. Chiefs and jarls hosted meals to demonstrate wealth, forge alliances, and intimidate rivals. The result was a hall full of half-drunk, heavily armed men lying down together under the same roof. Weapons were kept close because no Viking truly trusted another. What began as laughter over ale could end with a sword unsheathed before dawn. Archaeology even shows feasting halls doubling as armories, with weapons stored along the walls within reach of the benches where people slept. And then there were the animals served at the table. Pork was the Viking favourite, raised in household pens and slaughtered for gatherings. Goat, sheep and cattle were also staples, with bones tossed aside into midden heaps that archaeologists still sift through today. But the meat wasn't always fresh. Salting, smoking and fermenting were common preservation methods, and mistakes were frequent. Eating spoiled fish was so widespread that some historians argue food poisoning shaped parts of daily life. Going to bed with a belly full of rancid herring was less a misfortune and more a statistical certainty. Drunkenness added another hazard. Saga after saga tells of warriors drinking too much, insulting each other, and letting grudges erupt into violence. To sleep in a Viking hall was to lie in a room charged with potential conflict, like a tavern fight waiting to happen. You never let go of your axe because the man snoring beside you could wake in a rage over something said hours earlier. Feasting was bonding, but it was also fuel for bloodshed. Night did not erase tensions, it magnified them. Some scholars suggest the longhouse acted as both dining hall and dormitory, precisely because it made displays of loyalty and dominance impossible to escape. Sharing food and sleep forged unity, but also constant vigilance. You couldn't fake allegiance if you had to eat, drink and snore under the same smoky rafters as everyone else. The axe under your blanket was not just defence against raiders outside, it was insurance against the company inside. You roll in the straw again, your stomach growling uneasily. The scent of pork fat lingers in the air, blending with the sour bite of ale. Someone nearby burps so loudly it startles the goat in the corner, which bleats and kicks at the wall. Another man coughs into the smoke, the sound wet and heavy, before collapsing back into slumber. Sleep does not come easily when every noise reminds you how fragile the peace really is. By morning the feast is over, but the evidence is everywhere. Bones scattered near the fire, spilled ale soaking into the dirt floor, and warriors waking with headaches that only fermented fish could make worse. The longhouse is alive again, but nobody's refreshed. The cycle begins anew, another day of toil waiting outside the smoky walls, and just when you think the night's indignities are over, there is the ritual of relief. For the Vikings had no luxury of private toilets, and what happened when the ale finally worked its way through the body was a grim part of the nightly ordeal. The feast lingers in your stomach, but so does the ale, and sooner or later nature demands attention. The problem is, the Vikings did not build their homes with plumbing in mind. Toilets, in the modern sense, did not exist. Waste had to go somewhere, and in a longhouse packed with animals, children, warriors and smoke, that meant stepping outside into the bitter Scandinavian night, or using whatever crude arrangement the household kept nearby. Archaeologists excavating Norse farmsteads have uncovered pits dug just beyond the outer walls, often lined with wood or stone to keep the soil from collapsing. These were the Viking latrines, and they were about as charming as a hole in the ground could be. Walking to one was a battle of its own. The wind off the fjords could slice through every layer of wool and fur, and the darkness outside was filled with far more dangers than inside. Wolves prowled, enemies lurked, and the superstitions of the night made the world feel alive with spirits. You left the warmth of the hall clutching a torch, weapon at your side, praying you wouldn't meet anything waiting in the shadows. Even the sagas hint at the vulnerability of being caught outdoors at night. with raids timed to strike when men were most unprepared. A latrine visit could be your last. The waste pits themselves tell us more than just where Vikings relieved themselves. Studies of preserved latrine soil in Denmark and Greenland reveal parasites in abundance, from whipworm to roundworm. Every trip to the toilet was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The lack of sanitation meant worms thrived, making malnutrition a constant companion despite feasting on meat and bread. Researchers analysing coprolites, fossilised Viking droppings, have even identified fish tapeworms from improperly cooked meals. The parasites multiplied, ensuring that stomach cramps and fatigue haunted Viking nights as much as enemies with blades. Not every longhouse had the luxury of a proper latrine. In smaller farms or crowded settlements, a bucket or wooden tub might serve the purpose indoors. Waste would be dumped outside later, but until then the stench clung to the hall, adding another layer to the smoky barnyard air. You didn't just wake up to the sound of coughing or goats bleating. Sometimes you woke to the unmistakable odour of a neighbour's hasty midnight solution. Privacy was non-existent, and so was dignity. The only way to protect yourself from insult was humour, which the sagas show the Vikings had in abundance, often turning bodily mishaps into fuel for mockery. Weapons played a role here too. Imagine crouching in the freezing dark, garments hitched awkwardly, only to hear the crunch of footsteps nearby. With enemies known to ambush under the cover of night, you never went without your axe. Latrines may not be celebrated in sagas, but the warriors using them surely understood that the most vulnerable moment of all came when your hands were busy with something other than a weapon. Some scholars even argue that this constant awareness helped fuel the Norse obsession with vigilance, making alertness a virtue not just in battle, but in every mundane moment of life. The dangers were not only human. Waste pits attracted animals. Dogs and pigs scavenged freely, rooting through discarded scraps and waste alike. Rodents thrived in the same conditions, carrying fleas and spreading disease. The longhouse may have been crowded, but stepping outside meant competing with wildlife that had no sense of boundaries. Night soil was a resource to some creatures, a hazard to humans, and a reminder that hygiene was as much a battlefield as the seas the Vikings sailed. Even burial archaeology connects back to this unpleasant nightly reality. Several Norse graves include small tools and knives not designed for combat, but for daily chores, which could include cutting cloth or scraping hides used in sanitation. These small items travelled with warriors to the grave, showing that even in death, the daily grind of survival was not forgotten. To the Vikings, life was never separate from these unromantic tasks. The axe beside you was not only for raiding, it was your insurance policy against the humiliation of being caught unprepared during the most basic of human needs. You can almost picture it now, standing in the cold, torch sputtering in the wind, axe in one hand while you try to finish your business with the other. Your breath clouds in the night air, the ground crunches beneath your boots, and every sound from the forest feels sharper than it should. Sleep fades further away with each nervous glance. Relief comes, but rest does not. You hurry back into the smoky hall, fleas and all, grateful to survive one more trip. The longhouse greets you with its familiar orchestra of snores, coughs, and clattering armour. The fire glows faintly, reminding you that the night is not yet over, and neither are its ordeals. And as you settle back onto your straw bed, clutching your weapon tighter than before, another truth gnaws at you. For the Vikings, sleep was never simply a break from life. It was part of the endless struggle to balance survival, superstition, and dignity in a world where even the most private act was shadowed by danger. The hall quiets, but your mind does not. As the fire dies low and the smoke settles thick in the rafters, you close your eyes only to find that rest is another battlefield. The Vikings believed dreams were not random flickers of thought, but messages, omens and warnings from gods, spirits, and sometimes the dead. Saga after saga includes passages where warriors awaken shaken, convinced that visions of battle, blood, or strange animals foretold real danger. Sleep was never just sleep. It was a channel between the living and the unseen, and that made closing your eyes far more terrifying than leaving them open. One of the most common fears was the Draugr, the restless corpse that walked by night. Archaeological finds of burial mounds weighed down with stones suggest that people feared the dead would rise if left unrestrained. These beings were said to attack the living, crush chests, or spread sickness. If you were unlucky enough to dream of one, you might wake convinced it was truly there, standing at the edge of the longhouse, and in that half-dark panic your hand tightened on your weapon, ready to swing at shadows. Dreams didn't just frighten you, they trained you to respond with violence before thought could catch up. There were also fylgjur, animal spirits that appeared in dreams as symbols of fate. A wolf might warn of danger, a serpent of betrayal, or a bear of strength to come. These were not charming bedtime visions. They were heavy with meaning, discussed seriously the next day as guidance for action. Imagine the pressure of waking up after a dream of snakes only to face breakfast beside the man you suspected of treachery. Every vision was a potential spark for suspicion, and suspicion kept the axe close under your blanket. Dream interpretation was so central to Viking thought that seers and wise women gained reputation and influence by analysing them. Archaeological finds of staffs, charms, and ritual objects buried with women suggest their roles as interpreters of the unseen. If a warrior dreamed of a bloody battlefield, he might consult such a figure for advice on whether to raid or stay home. Your night terrors became the council meetings of the next day, shaping decisions that risked lives and wealth. In a culture that valued courage, even sleep became another test of strength. But there was a practical side to Viking nightmares as well. Sleeping in smoke-filled halls surrounded by the noise of animals, the stench of waste, and the constant bite of parasites was guaranteed to produce restless visions. Modern science would call it sleep deprivation mixed with carbon monoxide exposure, but the Vikings saw meaning in every hallucination. The rasp of a goat in the dark might become a demon in your dream, the sound of a neighbour's cough an omen of death. The line between waking and sleeping blurred, making night a theatre of terror that felt all too real. Even mythology tied sleep to cosmic battles. Odin himself was said to influence dreams, sending visions to chosen warriors or guiding them toward their fate. Some sources suggest that battle frenzies like Berserker Gang may have been connected to altered dream states, with warriors believing they had glimpsed their deaths before charging into combat. Nightmares weren't just personal, they were collective experiences, feeding into the mythology of destiny that defined Norse life. Every man who clutched his axe through the night was also clutching the belief that what he dreamed might decide whether he lived or died the next day. And if that wasn't enough, charms against bad dreams added another layer of absurdity to the nightly ritual. Amulets carved with runes, herbs tucked under bedding, and whispered chants were all used to ward off dark visions. Archaeologists have found inscribed bones and stones in Viking sites, believed to have been protective tokens. Yet the same bedding filled with fleas and filth was supposed to hold these charms, as though a few scratches in stone could compete with the reality of choking smoke and rotten straw. The Vikings fought the unseen with the same determination they fought their enemies, but the results were no more comforting than the dreams themselves. The social consequences of dreams could be devastating. Saga literature records entire feuds sparked by ominous visions, where one man's nightmare of betrayal became proof of conspiracy. In societies where trust was already fragile, a single dream could doom alliances. Sleep became dangerous not only for what you saw, but for what others believed you had seen. To say you dreamed of a wolf circling your hall was to cast suspicion on every man who entered it. Weapons stayed close not just to defend against the living or the dead, but against the consequences of imagination. You lie in the straw, scratching at your skin, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and sweat. Your mind races through visions of serpents and shadows, and every creak in the hall seems to echo what your dream already told you was true. You clutch the axe tighter, Unsure whether the threat comes from outside, inside, or within your own skull, sleep never offered rest. It offered riddles and warnings that lingered long after the fire died out. And just as the night stretches toward dawn, you realise the battle of sleep had another layer. For while you wrestled with visions in the longhouse, enemies outside believed the same omens and saw the same portents. Superstition was not confined by walls, it was everywhere, shaping raids, duels, and the fragile peace that defined Viking life. And as you drift uneasily toward waking, another thought gnaws at you. Even if you survived the night's dreams, the world of daylight had its own terrors waiting. The hall groans around you as the night drags on. Wood contracts in the cold, rafters creak, and sod from the turf roof drops in little clumps onto the bedding below. The longhouse was the pride of Viking architecture, but to sleep inside it was to accept constant risk. These buildings stretched as long as a modern airplane hangar, up to 75 feet, with thick wooden posts supporting roofs covered in turf. On the outside they blended into the landscape, looking like grassy hills. On the inside they were part fortress, part barn, part smoke chamber, and part death trap. The turf roof was brilliant for insulation, keeping the warmth of fires and bodies inside, but it also absorbed rain until it sagged under its own weight. Archaeological reconstructions of longhouses show drainage channels and angled beams designed to keep the roof stable, yet leaks were inevitable. Every storm meant drips trickling into your bedding, or worse, whole patches of sod breaking free and collapsing into the hall. Imagine waking from a half-suffocated sleep, only to find yourself covered in mud. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was a genuine hazard, forcing constant maintenance. Fire was the other enemy. The central hearth was both lifeline and curse. It was the only source of heat, cooking and light, but with no chimney, the smoke filled the hall until it hung in a permanent haze under the rafters. Modern experiments in reconstructed Viking halls show that carbon monoxide levels would have been dangerously high. To survive, people kept low to the ground, breathing beneath a smoky layer. At night, this meant you lay there choking gently while the fire kept burning only a few feet away. Too much wood and the sparks might leap into straw bedding. Too little and the cold would creep in, freezing your toes while your eyes still watered from the fumes. Archaeologists studying fire damage on beams from excavated halls note charring on rafters, clear evidence that smoke and sparks were a constant problem. Fires were communal, fed by whatever fuel was available, including driftwood, peat, and sometimes animal dung. The smell was unforgettable, and the danger inescapable. A single careless spark could turn a crowded longhouse into a tomb. Your axe might protect you from raiders, but it was useless against a firestorm that devoured walls and roof in minutes. The very layout of the building shaped sleep. Longhouses were divided into sections, with benches along the walls where people ate by day and slept by night. The centre was left open for the hearth, with livestock often kept at one end. Privacy was non-existent, but more importantly, every sound carried. When one warrior stirred, the entire hall felt it. When a child cried or a goat shifted, the echoes bounced along the beams until no one could pretend they were asleep. The architecture itself magnified unrest, ensuring that even when you lay still, your senses were always awake. In Iceland, where Viking settlers faced harsher winds, longhouses were sometimes sunk partly into the ground, creating semi-subterranean rooms. These provided better insulation but trapped even more smoke. Archaeological digs at Reykjavik and Eiríksstaðir show living spaces blackened with soot, evidence that walls and ceilings became coated after years of fires burning day and night. Sleeping there was like lying inside a chimney. Your lungs aged fast, your eyes burned constantly, and coughs became part of the nightly chorus. The sagas describe warriors with voices hoarse as ravens, which may not have been poetry, but simply smoke damage from a lifetime indoors. The design also had symbolic weight. The longhouse was not just shelter, but the centre of Viking social life, where feasts, marriages and disputes unfolded. To sleep inside it was to share in that collective identity, but it also meant sacrificing personal comfort for communal survival. Your place on the bench mattered. High-ranking guests were given positions close to the fire, while slaves and animals took the drafty corners. Even in sleep, hierarchy was enforced. Archaeological finds of decorated bedding fragments from elite burials suggest that those with status expected better rest, though the fleas remained democratic. Roof beams themselves carried symbolic meaning. Some sagas describe sacred posts within halls, carved with protective symbols and dedicated to gods. To sleep under such beams was to feel watched not only by kin but by divine forces. Yet when those same beams creaked ominously in the night, the reassurance quickly faded into dread. Was that the voice of protection or the warning of collapse? Either way, you kept your axe near, ready to fight raiders or scramble through rubble if the roof gave way. Even the entrances carried their own threats. Viking longhouses often had side doors as well as a main entry, practical for airflow but dangerous for security. Raiders knew how to exploit them, and sagas record sudden ambushes bursting through narrow doors at night. For sleepers, this meant another layer of unease. You didn't just worry about the man next to you, you worried about what might slip in while you dreamed. The axe beside your bed was less a precaution, and more a guarantee you would not be caught crawling for the door unarmed. You shift again on your straw, the ceiling low above you, dark with smoke stains. Every creak of wood makes you wonder if the roof will hold. Every snap from the hearth threatens sparks. Your lungs ache from the haze, your skin itches from fleas, and the chill at your feet reminds you the walls leak more air than they should. The hall was meant to symbolize strength, yet to live inside it was to endure endless fragility. The structure itself demanded vigilance. The axe under your blanket is no longer just a weapon. It is a psychological anchor against a house that feels as ready to kill you as it is to protect you. And when dawn finally breaks, the longhouse doesn't look noble or majestic. It looks like a sagging hill of turf, scarred by smoke and patched with repairs. The place where warriors dreamed of Valhalla was in truth a fire hazard filled with coughing bodies. You survived the night, but you know that tonight it will be the same. The hall protects, the hall suffocates, and you are forever trapped between its shelter and its dangers. The rafters still creak above you, but the noise of the longhouse is not just wood and smoke. It is the sound of every age and rank in Viking society packed shoulder to shoulder, all of them claiming their patch of straw as if it were a throne. Sleep here is not private. It is public, and your neighbours might be warriors, children, or slaves. The hall at night was a reminder that the Vikings were not only raiders and traders, but also families, bound by necessity to live together in ways that tested patience as much as endurance. Children were ever present. Archaeological digs at Viking farmsteads show toys carved from wood and bone, proof that little ones scampered through the same smoky halls. At night, they did not retire to nurseries. They collapsed into straw beside their parents or curled under blankets wherever space allowed. Babies wailed into the smoky air, toddlers kicked their neighbours, and teenagers whispered or wrestled long after adults wanted peace. The sagas mention nothing about bedtime stories, but they did not need to. The bedtime soundtrack was already a chorus of crying, coughing, and occasional laughter that carried through the hall. For every warrior gripping his axe in preparation for Draga, there was a mother trying to quiet a child so the rest could sleep. This mixture of ages created a strange balance. On one hand, families offered protection, ensuring that kinship remained the glue of Viking life. On the other hand, they guaranteed constant interruption. A warrior may have been prepared to fight an ambush, but he could do nothing against a toddler rolling into him mid-slumber. Your weapon was close, but so was a sticky hand tugging your blanket. Modern parents complain about sleepless nights. In a Viking longhouse, sleepless nights were the standard condition of family life. Slaves, or thralls as they were called, complicated the picture further. Archaeological evidence and written sources alike confirm that enslaved people formed a major part of Viking households. They cooked, cleaned, tended animals, and served their masters. At night, they did not sleep in separate quarters unless they were particularly valuable. Instead, they were wedged into the same longhouse, usually in corners near the livestock or the draftiest ends of the building. They shared the fleas, the smoke, and the filth, but none of the honour. A warrior's axe beside his bedding symbolised his vigilance. A thrall's lack of weapons symbolised his vulnerability. To be unarmed at night was not a choice, it was a reminder of your place. The sagas do not romanticise thralls, often describing them as disposable, yet their presence was essential. They were the ones who might rise earliest to stoke the fire or deal with waste, meaning their sleep was shorter and less respected. Imagine drifting off only to be shaken awake by commands to fetch wood, or drag a bucket of waste into the freezing night. For them, the longhouse was not just smoky and loud, it was an endless cycle of exhaustion. Weapons beside their bedding would have been unthinkable, not only because they were forbidden, but because the very idea of arming a servant in a house filled with half-drunk warriors was dangerous. Family hierarchy also shaped where you slept. The higher your status, the closer you were to the fire, enjoying a little more warmth and light. Lower status meant corners where drafts seeped through the turf walls. Children and thralls often found themselves at the outer edges, shivering while elites wrapped themselves in thicker furs. This arrangement has been confirmed by archaeological reconstructions, where benches along the walls doubled as both seating and bedding, with wealthier individuals enjoying carved decorations and better textiles. The division of warmth was as much about status as survival. The chaos of these mixed households had lasting effects. Modern historians studying Norse family structure argue that the constant proximity of kin, slaves and livestock blurred boundaries of privacy to an extreme degree. You never had solitude. Every cough, every nightmare, every midnight trip to the latrine was observed, remembered, and sometimes mocked. Sleep was not your own business, it was everyone's business, and when you awoke, you had to carry on as if sharing a room with 30 people was perfectly natural. It also created tension. Feuds could flare from small slights, and in a crowded hall nothing went unnoticed. If a thrall looked too long at a warrior's possessions, if a child disturbed someone's rest, if a guest demanded more space than custom allowed, the result could be anger carried over into the next day. The axe at your side was not just protection against raiders, it was a shield against the unpredictability of your own household. Anthropologists suggest this constant closeness reinforced Viking ideas of honour and reputation. With so many eyes on you, every action mattered. Even in sleep, you were judged by how you behaved, whether you guarded your weapon properly, whether you endured the noise without complaint, whether you maintained your dignity in conditions that stripped dignity away. The longhouse was not simply a home. It was a stage, and everyone played their part. You shift again, your ears filled with the overlapping sounds of humanity. A baby wails, a goat coughs, and a thrall mutters in his sleep before being kicked awake to tend the fire. The hall smells of wet wool, sour ale and dung. The weight of your axe is the only thing that feels certain, the only anchor in a sea of chaos. This was the Viking world at rest, if it can even be called rest, and it was shaped as much by family and slaves as by enemies outside. And as the night wears on, the thought lingers that if this is what home feels like, the outside world must be worse. Yet stepping out into the open brings its own perils, for the night sky above the Viking world was filled with omens, portents, and fears that sleep alone could never silence. The air in the longhouse never truly felt still, because beyond its turf walls the sky dictated everything. In the Viking world, sleep was not only about fleas, smoke, or children kicking in the dark. It was about forces too large to ignore. Seasons in Scandinavia twisted the rhythm of night into something strange. In summer, the midnight sun never set, and in winter, darkness swallowed weeks at a time. To live here meant sleeping under skies that refused to cooperate, and those skies carried meaning as heavy as any saga. During the endless daylight of midsummer, your body resisted rest. Archaeological studies of Norse farmsteads in Norway and Iceland show that work often stretched through the night, with labourers taking advantage of the long light to fish, farm and repair ships. Sleep became fragmented, broken into shorter intervals whenever people could manage. Imagine trying to close your eyes while sunlight poured through roof gaps at what should have been midnight. Children stayed awake, animals stirred, and warriors sharpened weapons by daylight that never faded. Your axe was never set aside, because day and night blurred into one. In winter the opposite came. Weeks of darkness draped the land, broken only by flickering fires and the occasional glimmer of moonlight on snow. Sleep in these months became heavier, yet no less restless. Archaeologists analysing isotope data from bones suggest that diets shifted in winter toward dried fish and preserved meats, leaving bodies sluggish and malnourished. Add to that the psychological weight of darkness that never lifted, and the result was a hall filled with lethargic, coughing bodies barely moving under heavy hides. Yet weapons still remained at hand, because the absence of light heightened every fear. Each crack outside was magnified into a threat. The northern sky was not empty. The aurora borealis shimmered in eerie colours across the horizon, and to the Vikings this was no scientific marvel. Medieval texts and oral traditions later linked these lights to the reflections of Valkyrie armour, or the flicker of departed souls. To fall asleep under that glowing sky was to believe you were being watched by spirits. If the warriors of Valhalla were battling above, then your own rest was fragile below. Archaeological finds of rune-inscribed amulets hint at protection against forces as vast as the heavens, small charms against cosmic fear. Even as you slept clutching your axe, you wondered if your dreams were tangled in those streaks of light. Storms were another torment. The North Atlantic climate was unforgiving, and Viking sagas are full of descriptions of sudden gales and tempests. Inside the longhouse, the turf roof muffled some of the noise, but the walls shuddered with every blast. Rain seeped through, wind howled across the beams, and thunder shook the hall like a war drum. For sailors used to reading weather as an enemy, storms carried a spiritual weight. Thor himself was thought to ride the thunder, hurling lightning as weapons. To wake in the night to a storm was not only frightening but symbolic. The gods were awake, and so you gripped your weapon tighter, as though it might help against lightning or flood. Even ordinary nights were filled with signs. The sagas mention comets and falling stars, often taken as omens of war or disaster. In a world where raids could break out without warning, a streak across the sky became a signal to prepare. Archaeologists studying Norse calendars carved on wood and stone have noted how celestial patterns were used to plan farming and seafaring. But they also shaped nightly rituals. Sleep under a sky filled with portents was uneasy sleep. Every flash of light or shadow of cloud could spark rumours that led to raids, feuds, or sudden acts of violence. The extreme conditions shaped Viking physiology too. Modern research into circadian rhythms in northern populations suggests that constant light or darkness distorts melatonin production, leaving people restless in summer and sluggish in winter. The Vikings may not have known the science, but they knew the exhaustion. Long daylight hours left warriors irritable, short nights made tempers fray, and extended winters fostered depression and illness. Rest never came naturally. It was another battle, fought against biology itself, and in that state of fatigue, weapons were all the more essential. Irritable men crowded in smoke-filled halls did not need much encouragement to draw steel. Superstitions tied to the sky bled into every corner of life. The Norse believed that the cosmos itself was structured around Yggdrasil, the world tree, with gods above and monsters below. Sleeping beneath the stars meant more than watching lights flicker. It meant lying between forces of order and chaos, knowing the balance could shift at any time. The midnight sun or endless dark became reminders that the world itself was precarious. To sleep with your axe was not paranoia. It was a gesture of respect to a universe that seemed determined to keep you on edge. You lie back again in the longhouse, staring at the faint glow slipping through roof cracks. Maybe it is the midnight sun refusing to set. Maybe it is the northern lights streaking green and red across the heavens. Either way, the hall stirs with whispers, animals shuffle nervously, and warriors mutter in their sleep. The axe in your hands feels heavier now, not because of raiders, but because the sky itself refuses to let you rest. And as you drift toward uneasy dreams, another thought flickers. If the heavens above dictated how you slept, then the weapons by your side dictated whether you woke at all. The night sky may have been beautiful, but beauty in the Viking world was always edged with fear. The weapon at your side is more than wood and iron. It is the line between your restless sleep and never waking again. In the Viking world, a blade or axe was not a mere possession. It was a piece of identity, forged with effort so intense that even the act of owning one marked you as someone to be respected or feared. Archaeologists studying Norse graves find swords buried with their owners, often bent or broken deliberately so no one else could use them. This was not only a tool, it was a soul-bound companion, as tied to your fate as your name. Iron was scarce in Scandinavia, which made weapons expensive. All had to be smelted in bloomery furnaces that produced small laborious batches, often mixed with bog iron scraped from marshes. A single sword could take weeks to hammer into shape, layered with different metals to create the distinctive patterns known as pattern welding. These swirling designs weren't just decoration, they were the fingerprints of a craftsman, proof that the blade was both durable and beautiful. When you clutched it under your blanket at night, you were holding the combined effort of miners, smiths, and a society that valued iron like treasure. The sagas make clear that not every Viking had a sword. They were prestige items, carried by elites or those who could afford them. The majority slept beside axes or spears, weapons that doubled as tools. An axe could fell a tree by day and fend off raiders by night. A spear could be used in hunting and combat alike. These were the practical companions, less glamorous, but equally deadly. Archaeological digs show spearheads were the most common weapon found in graves, a reminder that practicality ruled the Viking household as much as honour. The placement of weapons during sleep carried meaning. Some sagas describe warriors resting with a sword across their chest, as though even slumber was a rehearsal for burial. Others mention men laying axes beneath their blankets, blades hidden but always close. To be separated from your weapon was shameful, a sign of weakness. In a crowded longhouse filled with enemies, family and thralls, the presence of your blade was both protection and proclamation. You were someone not to be touched lightly. Weapons also tied into Viking religion. The god Odin was said to have discovered the runes while hanging on Yggdrasil, and these runes were carved into blades for protection. Archaeological examples of inscribed swords and axes survive, though weathered by time, showing that Norse warriors infused their weapons with spiritual power. To sleep beside a runed blade was to believe you were guarded not only by steel, but by the gods themselves. When nightmares of Draugr or betrayal crept in, your hand tightened on a weapon thought to hold divine strength. The psychology of this nightly bond cannot be overstated. In a hall where distrust simmered, where feuds could ignite at any moment, lying unarmed was unthinkable. Feuds were common in Viking society, and legal codes of the time, such as those from Iceland's Old Thing, often reference violent disputes that spilled into bloodshed. With honour at stake in every quarrel, the threat of a midnight attack was never imaginary. You kept your weapon near not only for raiders at the door, but for neighbours across the fire. Maintaining weapons was part of this nightly ritual. Archaeological evidence of whetstones found in graves and settlements shows how sharpening was constant. Warriors carried whetstones on their belts, sometimes carved into amulets in the shape of miniature phallic symbols, a strange mix of practicality and fertility symbolism. Before sleep, edges were checked, blades polished, and hafts secured. The sound of stone against steel was as much a bedtime routine as laying out blankets. In the quiet hum of the longhouse, it was also a warning, a reminder to everyone nearby that you were ready. Swords in particular were so revered that they were often given names. Sagas speak of blades like Skofnung or Tyrfing, each with its own personality, curse or legend. To own a named sword was to wield history itself, and you certainly did not leave such a treasure lying unattended in a smoky hall. You held it as you slept, as though sharing dreams with it, convinced that the bond extended beyond the waking world. It was not paranoia, it was intimacy, forged in iron. Even burial rites reflected this obsession. Archaeological digs across Norway and Sweden reveal graves where warriors were laid out with weapons across their laps or at their sides. In some cases, entire ships were used as tombs, stocked with weapons, shields and armour to equip the dead for their journey to Valhalla. This mirrored what happened nightly in life. To sleep armed was practice for the great sleep of death. To lie unarmed was to risk not only your life, but your honour in the afterlife. You shift on the straw, fingers brushing the cold iron at your side. The hall is filled with bodies snoring, coughing, muttering in uneasy dreams. But you're alone with your weapon, the only certainty in a world where trust is fragile and death never far away. The blade feels alive, humming with the labour of smiths, the breath of gods, the weight of ancestors. You do not let it go, because letting it go would mean letting go of yourself. And as the fire burns low and the smoke thickens once more, the thought grows that this nightly bond with iron shaped the Viking world as much as raids or feasts. Weapons were not stored neatly in racks or locked away for later use. They were constant companions, slept with, dreamt with, and buried with. To be Viking was to be armed, even in slumber, and the axe beneath your blanket was as essential as the blanket itself. The hall coughs as much as the men inside it. A rasp in the corner, a wheeze beside the fire, a child's thin cry splitting the smoky dark. In a Viking longhouse, sickness was never far away. To sleep here was to share not only straw and fleas, but every breath, every infection, every parasite. Modern studies of skeletons unearthed in Scandinavian graves reveal lesions, bone damage, and signs of chronic illness. The Vikings may have looked fierce in battle, but at night they were as fragile as anyone, trapped in an environment designed to spread disease as efficiently as smoke from the hearth. Tuberculosis left its mark in Viking remains, hollowing ribs and spines. The smoky air of the longhouse, thick with particles, would have worsened lungs already under siege. Archaeologists in Denmark and Sweden have found clear evidence of this disease, showing that coughing in the night was more than irritation. It was the soundtrack of life. You tried to sleep, but your neighbour hacked through the dark, each breath sending bacteria swirling into the same cramped air you were inhaling. An axe in your hand could fend off raiders, but it could not fend off infection riding on every exhale. Parasites made sure the misery was shared equally. Excavated latrines from Viking settlements reveal eggs of whipworm, roundworm and tapeworm, proof that nearly everyone carried unwanted passengers. Sleep was punctuated by stomach cramps, sudden trips outside and relentless itching. One study of preserved Viking feces in York revealed fish tapeworms stretching up to 30 feet long. Imagine drifting into uneasy dreams only to wake with your gut twisting from a parasite you'd been harbouring since last summer's feast. Every mouthful of half-cooked fish was a gamble, and every night was a reminder that food and filth walked hand in hand. Leprosy too haunted the Viking Age. Genetic studies of remains from medieval Scandinavia confirmed strains of Mycobacterium leprae circulating through the population. Those afflicted were not always cast out, as sagas mention individuals with visible signs living among their kin. In a smoky hall at night, that meant everyone shared space with the sick. The stigma may have been muted compared to later medieval Europe, but the reality was no kinder. You curled under your blanket, scratching fleas, coughing in smoke, wondering if the rash on your neighbour's arm was something you should be worried about. Even simple colds and flus became nightly torments. Without glass windows, longhouses leaked drafts, letting in icy air that cut through furs. Archaeological evidence shows walls were often patched with whatever was available, turf, clay or woven branches. But none of it stopped the cold. Crowds huddled together for warmth, which only made transmission easier. One sneeze in the corner, and the whole hall was doomed by morning. Sleep was less restoration and more slow-motion exposure. The superstition around illness shaped how people responded. Diseases were often seen not as germs but as curses or punishments from gods. Healing charms were carved into wood or whispered over the sick. Some sagas describe laying sick people closer to the fire at night, believing warmth alone could drive out disease. Herbal remedies were used, with finds of garlic, angelica root, and juniper berries at Norse sites suggesting attempts at treatment. But in the dark of the hall, these efforts were thin comfort. When a cough turned wet and rattling, everyone knew what was coming. Death moved quietly between sleepers, needing no weapon to do its work. The psychological strain of this constant sickness fed into the nightly need for weapons. Illness weakened bodies, but it also heightened fear. In a world where strength defined survival, to show weakness was to invite attack. Warriors clutched their axes more tightly when their chests wheezed, aware that sickness could rob them of the respect that kept enemies at bay. To die in bed from fever was shameful compared to dying in battle, yet many did. Archaeological studies of Viking cemeteries show far more evidence of disease than of wounds, a reminder that the silent killers struck more often than swords. Lice added to the torment. Combs carved from bone and found in Viking graves show how common the battle against head lice was, yet the war was unwinnable. At night, itching drove people to scratch themselves raw, further opening skin to infection. Flea bites joined in, spreading across the body until sleep became a restless shuffle of irritation. The sagas do not describe these details, but archaeology does, with parasite remains confirming the infestation was universal. If you were Viking, you were itchy, and you were itchy all the time. You turn again on the straw, the sound of coughing ringing in your ears, the smell of sickness layered on top of smoke and dung. Children wheeze, thralls mutter, warriors shift uncomfortably as parasites chew at their skin. The weapon in your hand feels heavier, though it can do nothing against what moves invisibly between breaths. Night stretches on, restless and foul, a reminder that death in the Viking Age was as likely to come quietly in the hall as it was loudly on the battlefield. And when the first light of dawn creeps through the turf roof, there is no relief. The sick rise alongside the healthy, dragging themselves back to labour. The longhouse breathes again, smoke rising, coughs echoing, children crying. Survival demands the same work, the same vigilance, the same weapons at the ready. You survived another night, but health was always temporary, and sickness waited to creep back in as soon as you closed your eyes again. The axe may have been your closest companion, but the shield loomed just as large in the nightly ritual. In a Viking hall, shields were not stacked neatly in armories, or hung purely for decoration. They lined the walls, leaned against benches, or lay scattered among the bedding. To live as a warrior meant never being far from your round, wooden disc of survival. Archaeological evidence from sites like Trelleborg and Birka shows layers of shields buried with warriors, not only as symbols of protection in life but as guarantees of safety in death. Yet before they reached the grave, shields served a far less glamorous purpose. At night, they doubled as pillows, walls, or even makeshift mattresses in halls so crowded you had to improvise to claim personal space. The average Viking shield measured around 80 to 90 centimetres across, made from planks of pine or fir, light enough to carry yet wide enough to protect most of the body. Iron bosses at the centre guarded the hand grip, and rims were sometimes reinforced with rawhide. This construction made them functional in battle, but also awkward in bed. Imagine rolling onto a wooden disc in the middle of the night, the iron boss digging into your ribs. Yet many warriors preferred to keep their shields at their sides. To set it aside was to admit you might not need it, and nobody in a longhouse wanted to make that mistake. Some sagas even describe warriors sleeping with shields pulled over them like crude blankets. In the coldest months, The extra layer of wood provided insulation against drafts that crept through turf walls. It was not comfortable, but it was practical. A warrior covered by his shield was both warm and defended, able to rise in an instant if the hall doors burst open. Archaeological reconstructions of longhouse interiors confirm benches lined with shields, suggesting that their presence was part of the nightly scenery. The glow of the hearth reflected off iron bosses, a reminder that protection was always watching, even in the half-dark. Armour too had its place in these nightly routines, though few Vikings owned full sets. Mail shirts, made of thousands of interlinked iron rings, were incredibly expensive, and helmets were rarer still. The Bayeux Tapestry, centuries later, shows Norman descendants of the Vikings armoured in ways their ancestors could only have dreamed of. For most, armour consisted of padded tunics or layered leather, items that doubled as clothing by day and blankets by night. A mail shirt might be draped beside you as you slept, heavy and stiff, but you kept it near to remind everyone of your status. To own mail was to own prestige. To leave it unwatched in a hall crowded with covetous eyes was unthinkable. The shield wall was the defining tactic of Viking warfare, and at night the concept carried into daily life. To sleep pressed shoulder to shoulder with kin and allies was its own kind of shield wall. Your weapon covered your body, your shield guarded your flank, and the man beside you served as part of the same living barrier. It was both security and vulnerability. If one link failed, the whole defence collapsed. Trust was demanded but not always earned, which is why your hand never strayed far from the haft of your axe. Shields also played symbolic roles beyond combat. In Norse poetry, to be shieldless was to be dishonoured. The sagas describe insults involving shields as gravely as insults about ancestry or courage. Archaeologists have found miniature shields buried as amulets, suggesting their power extended into the spiritual realm. To sleep without your shield nearby was more than risky. It was shameful, as though you were denying your own identity as a warrior. Even children grew up in halls where shields were constant background objects, learning early that survival meant keeping one within reach. The wood of these shields also carried stories of trade and craftsmanship. Some were fashioned from imported timbers, showing that even defensive gear tied into the Viking trade network, stretching from the Baltic to the British Isles. To own a shield of foreign wood was to display not only wealth, but connection. At night, leaning against the wall, such a shield told its own silent tale, a record of voyages carved into every grain. To roll over and bump into one was to be reminded of a raid past, or a raid yet to come. You shift again on the straw, the round outline of a shield pressing awkwardly against your side. The fire sputters, shadows ripple across iron bosses, and in the darkness the discs resemble staring eyes. Around you, warriors mutter in uneasy dreams, some clutching shields like talismans, others using them as crude tables for cups and scraps. Armour clinks softly as men turn in their sleep, and the hall is alive with the reminder that rest was never free of vigilance. By dawn, shields once more become part of daily life, strapped to arms or slung over backs, ready to form the wall of defence that defined Viking battlefields. Yet the memory of the night lingers. The wood still smells of smoke, the iron still feels cold against skin, and the knowledge remains that in the Viking Age, even something meant to block arrows might end up doubling as your midnight blanket. The sound of coughing fades, but the unease does not. For even if the hall is filled with kin, shields and smoke, the greatest danger still comes from outside. Sleep in a Viking world was never guaranteed because the night belonged to raiders as much as the day. The sagas describe ambushes timed carefully for moments when households were most vulnerable, and archaeological evidence of burned longhouses scattered across Scandinavia testifies that these stories were no exaggeration. To rest unarmed was to invite disaster. A Viking hall was both fortress and target. It housed wealth, food, weapons, and people, all of which made it a prize for enemies. Excavations of sites like Borg in Lofoten show massive structures built to house chieftains and their followers, their size alone advertising prosperity. Such hauls attracted envy, and envy turned quickly into raids. The larger the building, the more difficult it was to defend, because multiple doors, thatched roofs, and thin turf walls left weak points. Sleepers inside knew this, which is why weapons were not stored in racks. They were kept beside the body, ready for the moment doors burst open. The sagas give vivid accounts of such attacks. In Jarl's saga, men are trapped in their hall as enemies set it ablaze, forcing them to choose between burning or charging out into blades. Archaeologists excavating charred longhouses in Iceland confirm that fire was a favoured weapon. Raiders did not need to face a shield wall when they could collapse a roof in flames. To sleep while firewood piled against your door was to gamble with your life. An axe under your blanket was as much about hacking through walls as it was about fending off intruders. Fear of raids shaped daily life. Even legal codes acknowledged it, with punishments set for nighttime killings that carried harsher weight than daylight violence. Night attacks were seen as dishonourable, but dishonour rarely stopped them. Families feuded for generations, and surprise ambushes ensured that no hour was safe. Archaeological finds of hastily buried skeletons in Scandinavian farmsteads show wounds consistent with sudden raids, their graves shallow and hurried. These victims likely fell in midnight struggles when there was no time for ceremony. The design of settlements reflected this tension. Some farms were clustered together in defensive groups, while others stood isolated, vulnerable in open fields. At night, isolation was a curse. The glow of your fire marked your home across the dark landscape, and any traveller, ally or enemy could find you. You could not simply extinguish it, since heat and light were vital for survival. So you slept with weapons because you were, in essence, advertising your position to anyone who cared to notice. The psychological burden was immense. Imagine lying on straw, the smoke already stinging your lungs, while every gust of wind against the wall mimicked footsteps. Every creak of timber suggested someone testing the door. Archaeologists analysing soil layers in burned halls found evidence of valuables left behind, proof that attacks came suddenly enough to deny families even the chance to gather their wealth. This is why sagas praise men who leapt from sleep into battle, striking before they were fully awake. To hesitate was to die. Raiding was not confined to foreign shores. It happened between neighbours, rival clans, and even kin. The famous feud culture of Iceland, preserved in sagas, demonstrates how grudges erupted into sudden violence. To be unprepared at night was to hand victory to your enemy. Families raised sons on tales of vigilance, reminding them that weapons were never far from hand, not even in sleep. This ethos is echoed in the burial customs, where men were entombed with their swords across their bodies, as if eternal rest itself required the same readiness. The constant fear of raids also explains why longhouses were never quiet. Snoring was drowned out by shifting, muttering, the scrape of wet stones, and the restless sound of men unwilling to surrender fully to sleep. You did not dare sink into the vulnerable oblivion of deep rest. Instead, you dozed lightly, ears attuned for changes, fingers curled around axe handles. The hall was not only a dormitory but a barracks, its atmosphere charged with tension even when all was calm. Weapons themselves were adapted for this purpose. Axes with shorter handles, known as hand axes, were ideal for close quarters fighting inside halls, where longer weapons would catch on beams or shields. Archaeological finds of such tools in domestic sites suggest they served as both household implements and defence in tight spaces. A spear might serve well outdoors, but at night in a smoky room filled with people, an axe under your blanket was the sensible choice. You roll in the straw again, heart quickening at the sound of a door shifting in the wind. Your eyes catch faint glimmers of firelight on shield rims, and your ears trace the uneven breathing of kin around you. But your thoughts linger on the possibility of raiders crouched in the dark outside, watching, waiting. The axe at your side is not only wood and iron, it is the line between survival and obliteration. Every night was an exercise in readiness, and every dawn was a small victory against fear. By the time the sun finally broke the horizon, the danger had not passed. It only shifted shape. Enemies might still strike by day, but the hours of darkness were always the most feared. To be Viking was to live on guard, and nowhere was that clearer than in the longhouse at night, where even in dreams you rehearsed for ambush. The hall was never only filled with kin, it was also the arena where strangers and rivals were welcomed, because hospitality was sacred in the Viking world. To refuse a guest was dishonourable, and to insult one could spark feuds lasting generations. Archaeological finds of oversized longhouses with elaborately carved benches in places like Borg suggest that feasting and hosting were central to Norse identity. Yet to host meant to surrender privacy, and in a world without inns or hotels, it meant letting outsiders eat your food, drink your ale, and then collapse beside you in the same smoky chamber. The sagas are blunt about this practice. Guests were seated according to status, often near the fire or away from draughts, and when the drinking ended they lay down right where they sat. No separate guest rooms, no locks on the doors, just warriors, traders, poets, and enemies lying side by side on straw. To be a Viking was to wake in the morning unsure whether the man beside you was your new ally or your oldest rival. Your axe under the blanket was not only comfort, it was the only guarantee you would not wake with his hand on your throat. The paradox was obvious. Hospitality demanded trust, but the culture demanded suspicion. You offered food, ale, and shelter to the stranger, but you also kept a weapon near because the sagas remind us constantly that betrayal was never far away. In Egil's saga, feasts end in bloodshed more often than in harmony, with guests drawing swords after drinking too much. The ritual of hosting was a gamble. You could gain honour, but you could just as easily lose sleep, wealth, or your life. Archaeological evidence supports the scale of these gatherings. Feasting halls excavated in Denmark reveal long benches stretching the length of the room, capable of holding dozens of guests. Midden pits nearby are filled with animal bones, proof of massive meals. Yet once the feast ended, the benches became beds, and the very men who toasted each other by firelight were soon snoring within arm's reach, their shields against the wall and their weapons under wool blankets. The hall at night was less banquet hall, more powder keg waiting for a spark. The intimacy of sharing space magnified tensions. Imagine lying down with a belly full of pork and ale, fleas biting at your skin, smoke still thick in your lungs, only to realise your neighbour is the same man who insulted your family last spring. To roll over in the night and brush his arm was to risk a fight. No wonder sagas describe men sleeping in their clothes, weapons at hand. Even rest was political, every twitch a potential insult, every snore a reminder of proximity. The Norse legal codes reflected the importance of hospitality. Guests were promised protection under the law while in a host's home, but laws only mattered when people respected them. In practice, grudges boiled over anyway. Feuds erupted not in open battlefields but in smoky longhouses, where ale loosened tongues and grudges spilled out before dawn. To survive the night as a host meant balancing generosity with suspicion, smiling across the fire while gripping the hilt of your weapon beneath the blankets. The religious weight of hospitality made it even more complicated. The god Odin himself was said to wander the world disguised as a traveller, testing households to see if they honoured the laws of guest right. To turn away a stranger was to risk offending a god, but to welcome one was to invite danger into your bed. The axe under your furs was both weapon and insurance against divine irony. Better to risk offending Odin than to wake unarmed beside a treacherous guest. You can almost feel it now. The press of bodies in the longhouse, the stale stench of spilled ale mixing with smoke, the sound of warriors shifting uneasily on the benches. Some mutter in their sleep, others keep one eye half open, unwilling to surrender fully to rest. The man on your left is family. The man on your right is a guest who might be friend, rival, or future corpse. Your hand curls tighter around the haft of your axe, knowing that in this hall hospitality is as sharp as any blade. By dawn the custom remains unbroken. Guests rise groggy, thanking their hosts, sometimes forging bonds that last years, sometimes leaving behind seeds of resentment that will flower into blood feuds. The hall empties, the smoke lifts, and the weapons remain, silent witnesses to another night of uneasy trust. And the cycle continues, because in the Viking world, every feast was a test of honour, and every night was proof that survival meant never letting go of your weapon, even when lying beside your supposed allies. The longhouse was misery enough, but the sea was worse. On land you at least had straw and furs, however itchy or flea-ridden. On a ship your mattress was a plank of wood slick with salt spray. The Viking longship, marvel of engineering though it was, offered no comfort. Archaeological finds of ships like the Gokstad and Oseberg confirm that these vessels were built for speed and war, not for sleeping. They were sleek, shallow, and flexible, able to skim coasts and rivers. Perfect for raids, terrible for rest. A voyage could last days or weeks, and during that time warriors had no cabins or bunks. They lay where they sat, curled between rowing benches, their cloaks or furs pulled tight against the wind. Excavations of cloaks in burials show how valuable these garments were. Thick wool layered with sheepskin, heavy and water-resistant. Yet even the best cloak could not fully protect against spray from the sea. At night, men wrapped themselves in wet wool, shivering through cold northern winds, lulled not by calm but by the ceaseless slap of waves against wood. Weapons were never set aside. Swords lay across laps, axes were tied to belts, spears leaned beside benches. The sagas described raids beginning at dawn, after nights spent on the water, which means those weapons were clutched through hours of drifting sleep. Archaeologists examining ship burials find weapons arranged exactly where a man would have sat or lain, suggesting that to rest without one was unthinkable. The deck of a ship was not just transport, it was another battlefield waiting to happen. Storms added to the terror. The North Atlantic could turn vicious in minutes, and ships were built to flex with the waves, their overlapping planks held by iron rivets and tarred wool caulking. This flexibility saved lives but destroyed sleep. Imagine lying on a shifting deck that creaked with every swell, your stomach heaving, your ears filled with the roar of the sea. Norse mythology even turned this chaos into stories. Jörmungandr, the world's serpent, was said to encircle the oceans, his movements the cause of storms. To close your eyes in a storm was to wonder if the serpent itself was stirring. Food at sea did not help. Rations consisted of dried fish, hard bread, and ale or sour milk stored in barrels. Archaeological residue on pottery fragments confirms that dairy and fish were staples even on voyages. Eating this and then trying to sleep on a rolling ship guaranteed indigestion. The air smelled of sweat, salt, and spoiled food, and everyone aboard shared the same rhythm of nausea. If the fleas of the longhouse chewed your ankles, the sea itself chewed your gut. The psychological strain was immense. Unlike the longhouse, where the fire provided light, the ship at night was plunged into darkness, lit only by stars when clouds allowed. Sailors navigated by constellations, but for warriors trying to rest, the night sky offered little comfort. Every creak of the hull suggested weakness. Every splash of water threatened disaster. To clutch a weapon in that environment was not simply for defense against enemies. It was a talisman against nature itself, a small anchor of control in a world ruled by chaos. And yet, raids demanded it. Ships often approached coasts under cover of night, their crews sleeping in shifts as the vessel drifted silently toward villages or monasteries. To be caught unprepared in those hours was unthinkable. Warriors learned to sleep lightly, one hand always near the haft of an axe, ready to rise at a moment's notice. Accounts from Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe sudden dawn attacks, suggesting that the night before, those warriors slept half-conscious, blades beside them, waiting for the moment to strike. The wear on the body was clear. Skeletal remains from ship burials show signs of arthritis and joint stress, evidence of lives spent rowing and sleeping in cramped positions. Some skulls even show damage from helmets pressed too tightly, worn through nights for fear of ambush. To rest on a ship was not restoration. It was a slow grind of pain, exhaustion, and vigilance. The sagas may glorify the voyages, but archaeology reminds us that the human cost was nights of misery. Even burial customs reflected this maritime ordeal. The Osberg ship burial, one of the richest finds, included not only weapons and goods but bedding, textiles and furs. Death was imagined as another voyage, one where sleep would finally be unbroken. Yet even in these graves, weapons remained close, as though the dead too feared raids on their eternal rest. You can almost feel it, lying on the slick planks, your cloak damp and heavy, the sea spray stinging your face. The ship rocks, the timbers groan, and the man beside you shifts uneasily, muttering in his sleep. Your sword lies across your chest, your axe under your arm. The stars blur overhead, and you wonder if dawn will bring landfall or shipwreck. Either way, the weapon is the only certainty. It will rise with you, whether to raid, defend, or cling to, as the sea swallows the deck. By the time the first light spills across the horizon, your body aches from stiffness, your throat is raw from salt air, and your mind is fogged from sleeplessness. Yet you rise with your weapon still in hand, because on sea as on land, sleep was never safe, and to be Viking meant to be armed in every element. Sleep was never just about men and their weapons, it was also about the company they kept, both real and imagined. Vikings lived in a world where animals were not simply background creatures, they were omens, guardians, pests, and sometimes the only alarm system you had. To sleep in a longhouse or aboard a ship was to share space not only with other warriors, but with dogs, ravens, rats, and a shadowy bestiary of things half believed and half seen in the firelight. Dogs were perhaps the most familiar. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia show dog burials with collars and grave goods, indicating how valued they were. In sagas, dogs guarded halls and even accompanied warriors into battle. At night they were just as important. A growl in the dark could mean an intruder. A restless dog meant something was wrong. To Vikings, the dog was both companion and early warning system. Sleeping with one nearby was as vital as clutching an axe. Unlike the axe, though, it could lick your face at inconvenient moments, something medieval text rarely glorified, but anyone with a dog nose was surely a nightly occurrence. Cats too slink through the darkness of Viking homes. The goddess Freya, associated with love, war and fertility, rode in a chariot pulled by cats. Farmers prized them for pest control, and evidence of domesticated cats has been found in Viking settlements as far as England and Iceland. At night, these cats crept across straw bedding, pawing at cloaks, and occasionally delivering the unwelcome gift of a half-dead mouse. Imagine trying to rest while a creature sacred to a goddess chewed loudly beside your head. But not all animals were welcome. Lice, fleas, and rats thrived in longhouses. Excavations at medieval farmsteads reveal layers of insect remains, their shells preserved in bedding and floors. The Vikings may have fought bravely against kings and armies, but their true nightly battle was against creatures that could crawl into ears or nest in beards. Rat bones found in refuse pits suggest that rodents feasted on grain stores and scraps, their squeaks and scuttles keeping warriors awake. The sagas are silent on rats, but perhaps that is because no one wanted to admit that their glorious night by the fire involved swatting vermin from their bread. Above all, birds dominated the Viking imagination. Ravens were sacred to Odin, who kept Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, perched on his shoulders. Real ravens circled camps, picking over scraps, their calls carrying into the night. To hear one at dusk could be an omen, a reminder that the god of war himself watched your sleep. Warriors may have pulled cloaks tighter around themselves, weapons clutched harder, wondering if the birds were mere scavengers or divine spies. In some burials, raven bones were placed alongside weapons, proof of their symbolic weight. To sleep under their gaze was to sleep under judgment. The natural world bled into the supernatural. Norse cosmology teemed with creatures of the night. Draugr, undead warriors, were believed to stalk the living, rising from their graves to haunt settlements. Stories describe them slipping into houses, suffocating sleepers and spreading disease. Archaeological evidence suggests corpses were sometimes pinned with rocks or bound with stakes, perhaps to prevent these restless revenants from rising. When you curled up on straw with an axe, it was not just human raiders you guarded against. It was the fear that the dead themselves might return, dragging you into nightmares made flesh. Spirits were not only hostile. The Valur seeresses were said to commune with unseen forces, their rituals tied to sleep and dreams. Sleep was not passive in Viking thought. Dreams could be visions from gods or ancestors, warnings of raids or promises of treasure. To Vikings, the night was a liminal state where humans brushed against the divine. It explains why they guarded their slumber with weapons. What if a dream was not just a dream, but an invasion by forces unseen? Better to wake armed than defenseless. Even livestock shaped nightly life. In smaller households, sheep, goats, and even calves were sometimes brought inside during winter. Archaeological traces of animal stalls within longhouses confirm this mingling. The warmth was welcome, but the smell was not. Imagine a warrior trying to drift into heroic dreams while a goat bleated in the corner, or a cow shifted its bulk on the straw. Sleep came mixed with barnyard sounds and smells, hardly the stuff of sagas, but very much the reality of Norse life. And then there were wolves. Scandinavia's forests were filled with them, and their howls carried into settlements. The wolf was a symbol of destruction in myth, Fenrir destined to swallow Odin at Ragnarok, yet it was also admired for its strength. Farmers and warriors alike feared attacks on livestock or children. At night, a distant howl could freeze a hall into silence. Men might grip weapons tighter, convincing themselves that the log walls would hold, while imagining gleaming eyes just beyond the firelight. Some burials even included wolf teeth, talismans against the very creatures that stalk the dark. The blending of animal, human, and spirit in Viking nights reveals a world where sleep was never private. To drift into unconsciousness was to enter a shared space, crowded with dogs guarding, cats prowling, rats gnawing, and spirits whispering. Your weapon was not only protection against raiders, it was your anchor against everything else that crept in the dark. Archaeologists uncovering bedding layers in Viking sites often find charred straw, replaced regularly after burning to clear pests. This ritual burning suggests that even then, sleep was seen as a battleground requiring constant defense. You fought fleas with fire, wolves with walls, spirits with charms, and raiders with steel. To lie down weaponless would have been to surrender to all of them at once. Close your eyes and the sounds of that night crowd in. The dog stirs at the door, the cat leaps onto a beam, the rats scratch under the floor. Beyond the walls a raven calls, and further still, a wolf howls at the edge of the forest. You curl tighter, the haft of your axe warm in your palm, your breath misting in the chill air. Whether the threat comes from man, beast, or spirit, you are ready. Because to be Viking was to understand that night was never empty. It was filled with watchers, real and imagined, and only the fools slept without steel by their side. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. If you've enjoyed drifting off to the sound of historical misery, go ahead and check out some of my other videos. There's plenty more suffering where that came from, and let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear next. Want more lice, more ghosts, more questionable medical treatments? You decide. Either way, thanks for hanging out in the past with me, and I'll see you in the next round of historical suffering.